Hello, fellow risk takers, and welcome to My Worst Investment Ever. Stories of loss to keep you winning. In our community, we know that to win in investing, you must take risk, but to win in investing, you've got to reduce it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm on a mission to help 1 million people reduce risk in their lives. And I want to thank you for joining that mission today. Today's going to be a special episode because I recently met another man on a mission. And I asked him to come on this show to talk about his mission because I thought it was interesting and it was a little bit different than the mainstream narrative. So let me tell you, this is your worst podcast host, Andrew Stotz from A Stotz Academy. And I'm here with featured guest, Jusper Machogu. Jusper, are you ready to join the mission?
Yeah, I am.
I think you've got something to share. And so let me just introduce you to the audience. And Jusper is a farmer in rural Kenya, an agricultural engineer by profession, and a fossil fuels for Africa advocate. Take a minute and tell us about the unique value that you are bringing to this wonderful world.
So Africa is one of those regions that is um, very poor. At the same time, when you look at the economic development in Africa, like Africa is developing so slowly. And so I've been thinking about that for quite some time, and I think I have the answer to that. I've come to realize that we have been taken on this Western ride, which is actually all about ensuring that Africa never develops, because at the end of the day, we will be competing for resources. So what I'm bringing to the table is I'm saying fossil fuels for Africa, because the energy industry is driving every other industry. And so minus reliable, affordable, or cheap energy, there is no way Africa is going to develop. And so that's what I'm bringing to the table.
So you call it fossil fuels for Africa. How long have you been talking about this? Is it something new, something in the last couple of years, or how long have you been talking about it?
Yeah, I've been talking about it for, I think, 1.5 years now, or probably 1.5 years
Mm.
from the Corona period. So it's a new thing. I never actually imagined that at some point in my life I will be saying fossil fuels for Africa, because I was this climate, let me use environmentalist. So I was this person who really cared about the environment and thought that humans were a cancer on this planet because of how we were polluting it, how we were impacting it, etc, etc. So I'm surprised that while I was chasing for conserving the environment and fighting against fossil fuels, I'm here saying fossil fuels for Africa. Yeah, it's crazy.
Things change. It's
Yeah.
it's the sign of a bright mind that you change, your mind on what you think. I can't help but just think back to when I grew up. I was born in 1965 and I grew up in the US. We had the oil embargo and oil prices went through the roof in the 70s. And people went kind of nuts because that was a serious slowdown or impact on the economy for sure. But all my life I had cheap oil. I had a motorcycle that I could ride, my little moped from my little house where I, lived. I didn't have much money after I left my parents' home, and I could drive my moped to a factory an hour away. And I worked in the factory on the production line, and I didn't spend that much on the petrol in my motorcycle. And then I had a car, and I got in my car and drove all the way across America to live in California. And everywhere I went, I jumped in the car, and I think about all the I never experienced a blackout. I don't think in my whole life until I came to Thailand, and we had a little bit of blackouts, but not much. Thailand has really managed their grid very well. And so when I hear what's going on in Africa and I just think about that, and then having oil kind of trying to stop people from getting fossil fuels or reducing fossil fuels, it seems, like it's preventing you from developing. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what's going to happen in Africa if you can't get the fossil fuels you're needed to develop the way that you think things should develop.
It's sad that some of the largest financial organizations in the world are not supporting fossil fuels for development in Africa. Because like if you check it out today, the IMF and World Bank are not supporting fossil fuel development in Africa. And when investors come to Africa who want to develop fossil fuels, we have these paid environmental organizations and activists who are against that. A good example is the East Africa crude oil pipeline in Uganda, which environmentalists are dragging behind. Like, we are not developing that because of a few paid people who are a menace to that project. So first, when I say fossil fuels for Africa, I'm talking about energy, and energy is very essential. So at the moment in sub-Saharan Africa, a big region, about 90% of our energy needs are met thanks to burning biomass. Biomass is just, it's a fancy term for firewood, charcoal, cow dung, crop residue. That's where we are getting our energy from, compared to the rest of the world, which gets about 80% of their energy from burning fossil fuels. And as much as people say solar panels and wind turbines, so they don't realize that that's just electricity, and electricity is just a tiny percentage, about 18% of the total world energy consumption, 18%. So the rest is just energy in other forms. We have heating, powering tractors, etc. So we need fossil fuels for the energy part, leave alone the electricity part first. And that energy is how, because like if you wanted to touch every other African today, you realize that about 60-70% of our population depends on agriculture for livelihood. So one of the easiest ways for us to touch each and every other person, or most people, 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, is by improving agriculture. How are we going to improve agriculture? By having abundant, reliable energy. Right now, if you came to Africa, you're going to realize that, or if you read papers, you're going to realize that about 4% of in Africa, farm mechanization is at 4%. So out of every other thing that we do, farm machines solve 4% of that. If you went to the US, about 95%. So that's a very big number. Yeah. So, and there is no way we're going to electrify tractors or farm machines. There is no way we're going to do that, as much as these green environment organizations say that. Yeah. So first, I'm saying farm machines. Okay. So we have steel. Without steel, you can't have farm machines. And so I'm saying, let's have fossil fuels. Fossil fuels to give us the energy to power farm machines, so that we can now stop depending on our muscle to produce food. Like a farm machine, a good example is a combined harvest. A combined harvester can replace up to 1,000 people.
Mm.
Yeah, so
So
farm machines.
So that's a
Number,
great place to start, because I know a lot, like in Thailand, when I spent time in the rural areas, when I first came to Thailand, it was mainly buffalo that they were tilling with buffalo and then planting, and then maybe they could get some minimal machinery in there. But nowadays, there's people with the machinery that can then come to the farm and help with, go through and harvesting and go through and planting and go through and, all of the soil prep and all of that. But
yeah,
you're not at that stage in Africa right now, because as you said, 4% of people are 4% of the farming is mechanized using farm
yes,
machines.
yes.
Okay.
And so, yeah. And one thing I just remembered. So back in 1800, a farmer in the US, so farm labor, if say you were producing a kilo of wheat, you'd spend about 10 minutes to produce 1 kilo of wheat in your farm. Today, in the same US, a farmer is going to use maybe 2 seconds to produce the same amount of wheat, 1 kilo. So thanks to farm mechanization, farm machines solve all of that. They don't tire. And so number two, I'm saying let's have fertilizer. Actually, fertilizer should be number one because like once we start using fertilizer, nitrogenous fertilizer, we're going to produce more food. That's one of the easiest ways to improve livelihoods and economic development in Africa. So at the moment, you realize that on average, actually right now, today I was listening to this African summit on fertilizer and soil conservation, stuff like that, but it's mainly fertilizer. And it's a very interesting conference, only that we have a lot of crap, sorry about that, being discussed. People are talking about soil health, microorganisms and stuff like that, when it's so simple. What we need is fertilizer. And we have lots of fossil fuels in Africa to produce the fertilizer that we need. So today, on average, 1 hectare of land in Africa is using about 16 to 20 kilos of fertilizer, nitrogenous fertilizer. And that's annually. If you went to a place like the US, they're using about 120 kilos of fertilizer per hectare. If you went to Europe, about 160. If you went to India, 250. Go to China, 360 kilos of nitrogenous fertilizer per hectare. That's a big number. And that correlates very well with the production of on a hectare of land. So today we are producing 2 tons of corn, that's maize, per hectare. The US is producing 12 tons. 2 tons, the 2 tons that we are producing today is what the US was producing back in 1800 to 1900. So that's a very big difference. And most of that is from other things, fossil fuel, agrochemicals, let's say pesticides, herbicides, and stuff like that. But most of it is thanks to the use of nitrogenous fertilizers.
So let's talk about fertilizer. What is so nitrogen is the main one. I believe the other one's what, phosphorus, and I can't remember what, NKP. What?
Yeah, so NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
Potassium.
So nitrogen, yes, nitrogen is like one of the most important,
Yeah.
and of course the P and K, but nitrogen is the most important. So what we are using today is compost manure or manure. That's what most people are using, or cow dung. And you realize that cow dung has got a very low nitrogenous content, about 4%. Actually, it can't go past 4%. It's usually below that. And when people say let's use let's say wheat straw that has got a nitrogen percent of less than 1%, you can't compete with, let's say, urea. Urea is gotten from fossil fuels. So that's let's say methane. You mix methane with hydrogen from, sorry. So you mix with methane for the N. Sorry about that. So anyway,
Combine
I'm
hydrogen.
thinking too
Okay,
much now.
let's look at that. The way of making ammonia, which is the beginning
Yes,
of this, is to strip hydrogen from natural gas using
yes.
steam, which is producing CO2 as a byproduct, and then combine that hydrogen with nitrogen from the air at a high pressure and temperatures of hundreds of degrees Celsius. So ultimately, the source is natural gas. Then,
actually, the source is natural gas, and at the same time, what powers that particular reaction is methane gas. Sorry. So you realize that we need fossil fuels to produce the ammonium nitrate, let's say, or urea. And that urea has got a very high nitrogenous content of about 46%. So compare that 4% versus 46%. You realize that we need about 100 kilos of urea to provide the same amount of nitrogen content in a hectare of land that can't compete with, let's say, 10 to 30 tons of well-decomposed manure. 10 tons versus 100 kilos. That's a very big difference. And so that's why I'm saying, okay, number two, another easiest way to improve agriculture is fertilizer,
And just
nitrogenous fertilizer.
one last thing. I mean, I remember when the Ukraine war started off, it just seemed to me like countries in in Northern Africa as well, like Egypt as an example, but also in Africa in general, that were sourcing natural gas and the like. Also, wheat that they were sourcing in Egypt, for instance, for some of their staple meals. All of a sudden, those supplies either got very limited or the price just went up and it was scarce. But my question to you is, where is does Africa or specifically Kenya have a source for natural gas, or is it an imported item that really needs to be imported at the volume that you need to be more productive?
So today, today Africa doesn't have much fertilizer production going on. We usually import our fertilizer from the Middle East. It's sad because we have lots of LNG in Africa. We have LNG in Nigeria. We have LNG in Uganda. Like we have, I don't know why we have to get fertilizer from the Middle East when we can produce our own fertilizer. Actually, today, so the NPK that you are talking about, for the phosphate rock, we have about 60% of that, the phosphate rock in Morocco. Morocco is in Africa.
Mm.
And we exporting most of that to these other countries, the Western countries. But we can't use the phosphate rock to produce our own food. So, or we are consuming so little of that, it beats me.
Mm.
So number three is irrigation. As you know, one of the largest deserts in the world is in Africa. So the Sahara Desert.
Yep.
Yeah, and we can go for seasons without rain. So, but that's easily solvable. We can drill boreholes. We can desalinate ocean water. A good example is Somalia. Somalia is just nearby the Indian Ocean, but you realize that Somalia is mostly starving. We have many hungry people in Somalia, and we all wonder why they're saying they didn't have rains, let's say last year. And we have why can't they desalinate ocean water and irrigate their lands? It's so easy, it's so simple. But yeah, the other day, Museveni, the president of Uganda, was saying he has been trying to get funding for irrigation in his country, and he can't get that. But if he wanted a conference, let's say, to discuss food production, of course, it's going to get funding for that, but no for irrigation. So yeah, you get the drill. So once we have abundant food, we are going to we are going to add value to that. So there was a report, I think, back in 2016 or 2017. It was about cocoa production in Ghana and these southern countries, South African countries.
Yep.
And so they were saying that, sorry, Western Africa countries. So Ghana, cocoa from Ghana, and these other African countries. So they were exporting. So what happens is we farm the cocoa. We have companies from the European buying the cocoa. They roast the cocoa and now have chocolate, and chocolate sells very well. And you realize that at the end of the day, they make, let's say, 100 billion profit as profit. Now we're talking about profit, 100 billion. That was the figure. 4 billion of now, so 100 minus 4 billion. 4 billion is what goes to the African farmers. 96 billion goes to these Western corporations. So it's just roasting. The same happens for coffee. What's so hard about roasting coffee? You just need a source of fire, and that is literally it. So that's going to create, once we start adding value to the food that we produce, we are going to employ our people. At the same time, we're going to earn more from whatever we're going to produce.
Mm.
So the four are one of the easiest ways for us to improve on agriculture and improve on 6 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 Africans. And so when I say fossil fuels for Africa, I say that bit is for agriculture mostly, but I'm also saying that because we need the four pillars of modern civilization. So I said fertilizer, we really need that, and we can't have that minus fossil fuels. We can't have cement minus fossil fuels. We can't have steel minus fossil fuels, and we can't have plastics minus fossil fuels. So yeah, fossil fuels for Africa.
And okay, so that's a good overview of, that Africa needs, what Africa needs for abundant food is farm machinery, fertilizer, irrigation.
Irrigation.
Now, what is the force that's stopping that? Like for some people that don't know anything about this, they may be saying, so why can't you just get it? What is the force that's acting against that? Can you describe who it is, what country, what group, who is this that's trying to deprive Africa, let's say, from those core elements?
So recently, I had a conversation with somebody who reached out on Twitter, and we were discussing. So I did an article with one of my friends, and it was mostly on fertilizer access for Africans. And so he texted. Oh, so he texted me on Twitter, and then we got to email a little bit, and then he was asking like, why are you saying fertilizer subsidies? And so we had a Zoom meeting for about 1 hour, and we were discussing. So I tried explaining myself to this person, but at the end of the day, it was like, once we have fertilizer subsidies, I know that's what most capitalists, that's their stand. But so I'm gonna just say this. This is just my opinion. So most people say once we have fertilizer subsidies, let's say in Kenya, that's going to affect the market prices. And so my question is, so we have a country, we have people who want to feed themselves, and the government sees one of the easiest ways is for it to do that is, let's say they tax, let's say alcohol or some other products, and then they put that to, let's say, solving hunger, because once we have abundant fertilizer, we're going to solve hunger and of course improve improve our economies. And now somebody thinks that because the government of Kenya has done that, so Germany, let's say, so because we're buying the fertilizer from the Middle East, we're competing with, let's say, the Germany, we're competing with France, we're competing with the UK. These are countries that are far richer than Africans. So of course, there is no way we're going to compete with them fairly. These are rich people. So when I say, my thinking is like, fertilizer subsidies are a good thing. And anyway, so last year, our government, the government of Kenya, ended fertilizer and fuel subsidies, the new government. And after that, what happened is we had increased hunger cases because now people can't feed themselves. Or if you are producing food to pay for school fees, you sell the food and then you pay school fees. Now you are producing so little because you use so little fertilizer. Fertilizer prices went up almost 2 times. So if you are using 10 kilos initially, now you are affording, let's say, 5 kilos, and that means less production. That means less production from your farm. You get the drill. At the end of the day, you're making so little, or maybe you're going to starve, or maybe you can't afford to provide your family with the basic needs, clothing, food, education, stuff like that. And that impacts us negatively. I don't like that, because that's the IMF and World Bank were cheering our government for doing that. Actually, they forced the government to do that. and they have been doing that for a very long time. So the former government said no, have been saying no to the IMF and World Bank ending saying let's end fertilizer subsidies. But this other government is very corrupt. It's bribable. You give them a few billions, they can loot that. The top individuals, they loot that, they put that in their pockets, and they say, oh, we're ending fertilizer subsidies. That's good for our economy. It's not good for our economies. Yeah, so
let me ask you a question. You know, if you look at China, as you mentioned about fertilizer and nitrogen, China just, you know, when they realize that they need to really up their production to feed the, you know, mass of people in the country. Now, the difference maybe could be that China is a country versus Africa is a continent with many countries that have different policies. But so, you know, nobody stopped them, and they don't have the resources, natural gas. They have to import almost all natural gas and oil into China. Why is it that China could do that and still maintains a very high level of fertilizer in their agricultural production, and they're very productive with their agricultural production, and Africa doesn't, or, you know, pick a country in Africa doesn't or can't?
Okay, so I don't know. Have you read a book titled something, the economic hitman?
Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
the guy who worked for the
So
IMF, and I was in 1997 when we had the bot crisis in Thailand. The IMF came in, and I could see some of what he was talking about in that book, of the way that they, you know, they came in with a very heavy hand for sure. But anyways, go ahead.
yeah, so we have lots of economic hitmen in Africa, and the sad thing about Africa is that we are divided by these boundaries that were made by people wanted to colonize us. So that alone kills us, because now a divided people is so easy to conquer. We can't say no. Okay, Kenya could say no. Uganda is going to say yes to the economic hitmen. So that's what's happening. And even right now, look at what the UN is doing. The UN has got its 17 Sustainable Development Goals for 17 top problems that we have in Africa. And it's that one of those problems the UN says is climate change. And so when they say sustainable, the sustainable bit in the Sustainable Development Goals just means that if in every other solution, like if we're going to solve hunger, we're going to do it sustainably. Sustainably just meaning we make sure that we conserve the environment. That's what it literally means. So if we're going to ensure that people have access to clean water sustainably, every other problem sustainably, climate change. And climate change just means, so what the UN is saying right now, climate change is caused by the how us burning fossil fuels. And so you see where that goes. So it's we can't use fossil fuels, because as much as we want to solve our top problems, we shouldn't use fossil fuels, because that's going to impact the climate, or that's going to cause climate change. So the IMF is one of the biggest like economic hit organization,
Hitman.
hitman
Yep.
in Africa.
Yeah.
And so when you look at it, so we have African countries pledging to these net zero by 2030 or 2050. China and India are saying we're going to continue burning coal until 2060. That's what they're saying. And until then, yeah, you can't stop us. They are saying that
But
loudly and
Africa
proudly.
doesn't have a unified voice. Number one is part of it, as you've said. I was talking to one of my students who lives in South Africa, and he was telling me that they're just experiencing more and more blackouts because Germany's has a lot of pressure on the South African government to shut down coal mines. And the result of that is now they're getting intermittent electricity. And so, you know, we've talked about IMF, we've talked about World Bank, we've talked about UN. You know, if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, it's almost a joke when you look at it, because the contradictions in that make your mind blow your mind. You either got to be absolutely blind, or maybe not smart enough to figure it out. But if one of your goals is to eliminate poverty, the most critical thing for eliminating poverty is food and energy.
Mm-hmm.
And food is produced through the use of energy and fertilizer, as you say. And so there's just a tremendous contradiction. But the contradiction doesn't matter so much if you're living in a rich country that's already enjoying the benefits of all of that. But the
Yeah.
contradictions really, I think what part of what you're talking about is the contradictions hit home, and all of a sudden you're boxed in where you need to produce more, but you're not going to be able to get the resources to do that. And you're stuck in this, all of a sudden, wait a minute, what's happening with us is another factor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So last year we had a National Tree Planting Day that the government announced in like 3 days. So it was like on a Thursday, and the government just said, next week on Monday, we're going to have a National Tree Planting Day. Nothing is going to go on, like no jobs, no work. You just stay home, plant trees. We're going to provide you uh,
Saplings
seedlings.
or seeds.
Yes. And that's what happened. So so just today I learned that next week, oh, actually I think it's tomorrow. So tomorrow is supposed to have a National Tree Planting Day, thanks to the IMF and World Bank. The IMF says, like, if you want a loan from us, of course you're going to have a National Tree Planting Day, and the government can't say no because they
Yeah.
need the funds. So yeah, that's happening. That's happening.
Yes.
Oh, and by the way, uh, back in 2020 or 2021, did you see what happened in Sri Lanka? Because the government listened to the IMF,
Yep.
and they said that we're going to end, we are going to end the use of nitrogenous fertilizer. We're going to go the organic way, how our forefathers used to live.
Mm.
So once they did that, what happened? The government was just overthrown in a few days because the country was in chaos.
And going and getting
See,
starved.
yes,
And
tea
the currency
production went
absolutely,
down.
for those people that, let's step back and say, for those people that didn't watch that, basically what happened was, for some unknown reason, but maybe from pressure, very smart. And Sri Lankan leaders are actually quite smart. I'm pretty impressed. I've been there, and I know I have a lot of friends, and my former boss was from Sri Lanka, and just absolutely impressed with his intellect. But I know they're also very deeply involved with IMF and World Bank individually, and they work there. So someone came up with the idea that, hey, let's go and, get rid of nitrogen and fertilizer in general, let's say nitrogen specifically. And all of a sudden, their crop production absolutely collapsed. And very soon after that, their currency started collapsing. And when their currency started collapsing because they weren't able to export and earn any income, all of a sudden, anything that they wanted to buy outside, and Sri Lanka is a very small country, it's not like they're manufacturing a lot, everything became expensive. All the medicines and all that became massively expensive. And then there was a massive uprising, and within days they toppled the government and had to rethink that policy. So that's a little background on Sri Lanka. But how does that relate to what you're seeing happening in Africa?
So the same IMF is the same IMF that pushed Sri Lanka to starving, and it is the same IMF that's pushing the government of Kenya and other African countries to end fertilizer and fuel subsidies. It's the same IMF,
Mm,
the
mm.
economic hitman, another economic hitman.
And there's one other factor that I want to touch on, just because I don't really know much about Africa. I don't know much about the history, and I actually am looking forward to getting to Africa this year. And I haven't set my plans yet, but I look forward to having a cup of coffee together. But uh, the thing that some people may say, well, it's not about fuels. It's just Africans are not ambitious like the Chinese. Maybe the Chinese are. I mean, when I go to China, my Chinese friends to me, I think I'm pretty good in business. I'm doing pretty well. I got all this. And they're like looking at me like, you're so slow, Andrew. You're so slow. Like, why? It takes you 3 years to do this, and we do it in, 3 weeks. And I just feel like such a slow businessman. But one of my questions for you is, what about the psyche of Africa or the countries? Are they ambitious? Are they, if they can get this nitrogen, they're ready to move? Or is there other factors that are inherent in Africa that I just don't know?
So, so the West focused so much on in Africa. They forgot about China because China, they thought China doesn't have much, let's say, mineral resources. China doesn't have its own oil. It does have coal, but coal is plenty in Germany and these other countries. So they really didn't focus much on China. So they put their focus on Africa because Africa has got this like immense amount of mineral resources.
Mm.
Now China also has been like fighting so hard against the Western organizations or Western governments that want to colonize them. And now today you can see the war. They say the cheap wars, manufacturing wars between the Western countries and China. I really like the Chinese approach, their policies. Like they don't care. They all they care about is human flourishing. So Africa, as much as we want to develop, I know every other youth from my community wants to flourish. They want a beautiful house. They want to drive a car in future. They want better education, better clothing, better phones, etc., etc. We want to have access to electricity, clean water, laundry machines, all of the good stuff. We want that. But even when we elect and corrupt politicians, let's say a president, when we elect a good president, a president who thinks or who puts our needs at the top, the West is going to find a way to get that person out.
Sabotage.
Yes, sabotage. If they can't pay the leader, the person, they're going to find other ways. So
yeah, so
we are
is
in a big mess.
That is one thing that I found that was really kind of shocking is that, growing up in America, I thought that America really was out there in the world to promote democracy. And, it didn't take long and a bit of reading of history and understanding the people behind the scenes, realizing I'm not convinced America has any interest in democracy around the world. I just don't think that is not the goal. But I want to wrap up in just a few minutes, but I have a theory that I presented to my clients about a year or so ago. My clients, let's say, are fund managers and investors in Thailand, professional institutional investors. And I write research that I try to look ahead to say what's going to happen and what should you own. And about a year and a half ago, I produced a report and I said that we are in the middle of World War 2.5. And they knew that the Russian invasion or the annexation that's happening in Ukraine, that was going on. So they could see that there's a war. So I asked them, it's America against who? And this was my question. And for the listeners and the viewers, think World War 2.5 is America against who? Well, the first question is, well, is it America against Russia? And I said, no, I don't think America doesn't really. All America wants ultimately from Russia is access to oil and gas and minerals and uranium and all of that. But from an economic perspective, Russia is not a threat. Maybe from a nuclear perspective, yes, but still, I think Americans don't see that. So then the next one, they said, well, is it America against China? And I said, no. So I said, the World War 2.5 is actually finished. It's over, and America won. Who did they fight? Europe. And America just dominated Europe. Not one European leader is able to stand up to America. America now absolutely controls NATO and has now gotten as many European countries into NATO as it possibly can. America has basically, economically, has dominated Europe and crushed Germany, because if you look at the flow of oil and gas into Europe, it's all come from the heart of the Russian oil and gas fields. And when they blew up the pipeline, the Nord Stream pipelines, basically that was the end, and they disconnected Europe from their cheap energy source and its main energy source. And so America, on many sides, politically, militarily, economically, has now dominated Europe. So now the question is, why did they need to do that? And again, this is all my theory, right? Why did they need to do that? Because America's going to war with China. And they're marching down that path already. And the problem is that Africa doesn't want a world war between America and China. India doesn't want a war between, US and China. Nobody really wants that. But if they can get a hold of the Europeans and get them to also now disengage from China and see China as an enemy, now they have all the economic and political power that exists in this world. Let's say 90% of it is concentrated in US and Europe. And they can then force this war, World War III, on the rest of the world. That was my theory, but there's a last part of the theory. And I asked my clients, where do you think World War III is going to happen? And my clients said, well, Taiwan. I said, nope, Africa. You see, America has neglected Africa for many, many years. They didn't have much to pay attention to with Africa. I would say Europe paid more attention to Africa than America did over the last 20 or 30 years. But it's a little bit like I had a lady that I once was considering dating, and she said to me that I said, are you separated or divorced or what? She said, yeah, I'm separated. But my husband's got another family and you don't have to worry about it. We can date. I said, the minute your husband sees you with another guy, he's gonna care. And I think that's what's gonna happen with America. They're gonna see, and they are seeing, that China has dominated. All of the resources are now going to China for refining and all of that. And China has made relationships in Africa way beyond where America is. And that's where I think the sticking point, maybe it's not going to be a physical war in Africa, but the confrontation over resources is probably going to happen there. So anyways, that's a long-winded description of my thing that I told my clients. But what do you think makes sense of that? And what do you think that doesn't make sense of that? I'd love to hear.
So it's a good theory that I agree with mostly. So I like Russia because Russia has been all about Africa developing. They some other time give us free fertilizer. It's a good thing when you care. So the UN and these Western organizations, the West gives us aid.
Yep.
And they, at the end of the day, they take most of that aid. So they use that to live in their big hotels. They fly in their beautiful aeroplanes, etc, etc. So most of that goes still back into their pockets. With Russia cares about solving hunger in a different way. So they're giving us fertilizer, nitrogenous fertilizer, because they have lots of that and they produce it very cheaply. So same thing with China. China is ensuring that Africa develops. They're building railways in Africa. They're building ports, roads, etc, buildings, etc, etc. And now that makes the US mad because what they have been doing is ensuring that Africa never develops. China and Russia are here. They trying to ensure that Africa develops because China wants Africa to develop so that they can sell us their products. They're producing plenty of that. And in future, if all doesn't go well with these European countries where they export most of their products to, they will want to have another market. I think at the end of the day, the US wants to be a superpower. Number one, it's the US versus every other person, every other country. That is it. So if we are poor, if we are not united, the US can control us. They want to control our resources, etc, etc. So I think that's it.
I want to wrap up by letting you just, summarize the message that you're trying to get out to people so that everybody understands it. And I also want to tell everybody that you can find find Jusper on Twitter, and the handle is at JUSPERMACHOGU. You can also find him on Substack. I'm going to have the links to both of those in the show notes, so you can click on it and go there and have a debate and a discussion. So over to you to close it out.
Okay, so I'm all about economic development in Africa. I want Africans to have what the rest of the world has. I want Africa to be able to feed itself. I want Africa to have access to reliable, abundant energy. I want Africa to have lots of food for, economic development. So at the end of the day, you realize that we need lots of fossil fuels, and we have plenty of that. We don't need much aid. What we need is investors in Africa. Let's drill our oil. Let's tap into our natural gas. Let's mine our coal. Let's use that to develop ourselves. That's literally it. So that's why I'm saying fossil fuels for Africa.
Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. I think for the listeners and the viewers out there, it's a little different from what I normally do, but I felt like your message and all that is an interesting message, and it's also a counter message than what we're normally hearing. Part of being a great analyst, in my case, is that you've got to listen to all sides of the story. So I want to thank you for this great discussions. And again, listeners, you can go to Twitter, you can go to the blog that I have that you can click through on this episode, and you can connect with Jusper and learn more and support him in, what he's trying to do. This is your worst podcast host, Andrew Stotz, saying, I'll see you on the upside.